A gate agent's final boarding call echoes through the sterile calm of an airport terminal. For 17-year-old Eric Thorne, it's a call to his future, a flight to the National Academic Decathlon, the culmination of his young life's work. But for Captain Ryan Sterling, a pilot with a 30-year unblemished record, it's a moment to enforce a rule. What happened in the next 10 minutes on that jet bridge wouldn't just cost a boy his dream. It would ignite a firestorm that would vaporize a $200 million sports deal, disgrace a celebrated pilot, and uncover a dark secret that had remained buried for 2 decades. This isn't a story about a missed flight. It's about how one man's prejudice became a corporation's nightmare, and how karma, when it finally arrives, is always right on time. The air in Gate C-27 of Chicago O'Hare International Airport was thick with the scent of stale coffee and the low hum of anticipatory anxiety. It was the scent of travel, a smell 17-year-old Eric Thorne usually loved. Today it felt suffocating. He clutched the strap of his carry-on, a sleek carbon fiber case containing the Archimedes box, his entry for the National Science and Technology Decathlon in San Diego. It was his masterpiece, a self-contained, solar-powered water purification system that he believed could change the world. More pressingly, it could win him the prestigious Kittering Scholarship and a full ride to MIT. He was one of the last aboard Summit Air Flight 712. He'd been triple-checking the schematics on his laptop one last time. As he approached the gate, a harried agent scanned his ticket. The machine chirped its approval. "Have a good flight, Mr. Thorne." Eric smiled, a brilliant, easy smile that had charmed every teacher he'd ever had. "Thank you. I will." He walked down the jet bridge, the muffled roar of the Airbus A321's engines growing louder. At the aircraft door, a flight attendant greeted him with a practiced smile. But next to her stood the captain. He was a man in his late 50s, with a ramrod posture and silvering hair cut in a severe military style. His name tag read R. Sterling. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, were fixed on Eric's carbon fiber case. "Good morning, son," Captain Sterling said, his voice polite but firm, lacking any warmth. "What's in the box?" "Oh, it's my project for the National Science Decathlon," Eric answered, his enthusiasm bubbling over. "It's a water purifier. Self-contained multi-stage filtration. The casing is just to protect the delicate components." Sterling's gaze didn't waver. "I need to see inside it." Eric's smile tightened slightly. "I'm sorry, Captain, but I can't. The internal components are sealed in a specific sequence. Opening it outside of a lab environment could compromise the entire system. It's all been cleared by TSA security. They scanned it twice." He held up his hands to show the yellow inspection tag still looped around the handle. Captain Sterling stepped forward, physically blocking Eric's path into the cabin. "TSA works for the government. I work for Summit Air. On my aircraft, I am the final authority on safety. I don't like the look of it. It's an unidentifiable electronic device with a dense power source in a hardened case. That's 3 red flags. Open it, or it doesn't get on this plane." The flight attendant, a young woman named Chloe, shifted uncomfortably. "Captain, he has the TSA tag." "I'm aware of what he has, Chloe." Sterling cut in his eyes, never leaving Eric. The other passengers filing past were beginning to stare. A low murmur rippled through the jet bridge. Eric felt a familiar, cold knot tighten in his stomach. He'd felt it before, the subtle shift in atmosphere when a person in authority decides you are a problem to be managed, not a person to be helped. He kept his voice steady and respectful. "Sir, with all due respect, this is my future in this box. I can show you the schematics on my laptop. It's just a battery, a few pumps, and some filters. There's nothing dangerous." "Schematics can be faked." Sterling said flatly. His tone was dismissive, as if explaining a simple concept to a child. My decision is final. You can either open the case now, or you can step off my jet bridge and take a later flight. Your choice. The implication was clear. The case wasn't getting on the plane. If Eric stayed with his project, he was out. Humiliation washed over him, hot and sharp. He could feel dozens of pairs of eyes on him. He saw a man a few rows back lift his phone, the screen's glow, a telltale sign of recording. This is completely unreasonable, Eric said, his voice shaking now, the carefully constructed wall of composure beginning to crack. You're disqualifying me from a national competition based on a look. I've done nothing wrong. I followed every single rule. My primary rule is the safety of my 180 passengers, Sterling retorted, his voice rising in volume, projecting authority. And I will not be lectured on procedure by a teenager. Now make your choice. We have a schedule to keep. The finality in his voice was absolute. There was no appeal, no discussion. Eric looked past the captain into the brightly lit cabin at the faces of the people who would be flown to San Diego. He saw his own reflection in the cockpit window, a young black man in a hoodie and jeans, holding a strange box, being told he was a threat. Defeated, Eric stepped back. The tears he refused to shed burned behind his eyes. He turned without another word and walked back up the jet bridge, the silence of the other passengers a deafening roar in his ears. As he reached the top, he heard Captain Sterling's voice, clear and cold, speaking to the flight attendant. See to it his checked bag is pulled, and close the door. We're already late. Back in the terminal, the gate agent looked at him with a mixture of pity and confusion. What happened? Eric couldn't speak. He just shook his head, the weight of the carbon fiber case in his hand, suddenly feeling impossibly heavy. He had just been publicly humiliated, his dream jeopardized not for breaking a rule, but for a pilot's gut feeling. A feeling that had looked at a brilliant young scientist and seen only a risk. He didn't know it yet, but the man with the phone had already uploaded the video. The clip was only 47 seconds long, but it was all it took. The firestorm was about to begin. The video was raw, shaky, and devastatingly effective, titled Summit Air Pilot Kicks, Black Teen, Genius Off, Flight to Science Fair. It was uploaded to Twitter by a passenger named Greg Mills, a sales manager who recognized an injustice when he saw one. He hadn't caught the beginning of the conversation, but he'd captured the crucial part, Captain Sterling's unyielding ultimatum, and Eric's quiet, heartbroken retreat up the jet bridge. Within the first hour, it had 1,000 retweets. By the second hour, it had hit 50,000. Celebrities, activists, and journalists began sharing it. The hashtag #LostAFlyingWhileBlack trended alongside Dasha Summit Air Hates STEM. By the time Flight 712 touched down in San Diego, Summit Air was the #1 trending topic in the United States, and not for their bargain fares. The story had everything the modern media landscape craved: a clear villain, a sympathetic hero, and a gross abuse of power. News outlets quickly identified Eric Thorne from his boarding pass, visible for a split second in the video. They found articles from his local newspaper, praising his academic achievements, his work with underprivileged kids, his robotics club championships. He was by all accounts a model student and a budding genius. The narrative was cemented. A brilliant young black man was being held down by a prejudiced system personified by a white airline captain. Inside Summit Air's gleaming corporate headquarters in Dallas, the atmosphere was one of controlled panic. The CEO, David Chen, was a man who lived and died by data. He'd built Summit Air from a regional carrier into a national competitor through ruthless efficiency and a savvy marketing strategy. His screens showed him a real-time data visualization of the unfolding PR catastrophe. The red lines indicating negative brand sentiment were spiking to terrifying heights. "What do we know?" Chen demanded, pacing his office. His communications director, a sharp woman named Eleanor Vance, read from her tablet. "The pilot is Captain Ryan Sterling, 32 years with us, ex-Air Force, flawless record, not a single official complaint in his entire career. He's a senior instructor union rep, by the book to a fault." "The book just cost us millions in brand equity," Chen snapped. "What's his statement?" "He filed a standard incident report from his layover hotel in San Diego," Eleanor said, scrolling. "He claims the passenger was carrying a suspicious homemade electronic device in a hardened case and refused a visual inspection. He cited FAA regulation 121.258, the captain's discretionary authority on security. He says he made a judgment call to mitigate a potential unverified threat." Chen threw his hands up in exasperation. A threat? The kid was going to a science fair. Did anyone in Chicago think to use an ounce of common sense? "Call the station manager. Get a supervisor." "It happened too fast," Eleanor admitted. Sterling made the call on the jet bridge. By the time the gate agent could have escalated it, the door was closed, and they were pushing back. From a procedural standpoint, Sterling was within his rights. From a public relations standpoint, he just threw a grenade into this company. The phone on Chen's desk buzzed. It was a direct line, one only a handful of people had the number for. The display read, "Evelyn Reed." Chen's blood ran cold. Evelyn Reed was the CEO of Novatech, the Silicon Valley giant, that was in 3 days supposed to sign a 10-year, $200 million deal for the naming rights to the new stadium of the San Viento Vipers the NFL team Summit Air sponsored. The deal was Chen's crowning achievement, the move that would catapult Summit Air into the same league as the legacy carriers. Summit Air Stadium. It was supposed to be his legacy. He took a deep breath and answered. "Evelyn, good to hear from you." "Cut the crap, David." Evelyn's voice was as sharp as cut glass. "I'm looking at a video of one of your pilots harassing a black kid who looks like he could be my nephew, a kid who I might add is exactly the kind of person Novatech's Future Leaders in STEM program is designed to support. What in the hell is going on?" "Evelyn, we're handling it," Chen said, trying to sound calm and in control. "It's an unfortunate incident. The captain was following security protocols." "He was following his biases," she shot back. "I've seen the kid's picture. He's a prodigy, and your captain treated him like a terrorist. My board is watching this. Our entire brand is built on innovation, inclusivity, and forward thinking. Tying our name to a stadium sponsored by an airline that embodies the exact opposite is problematic." "It was one employee, Evelyn. He's been suspended pending a full investigation," Chen pleaded. "The world doesn't see one employee, they see Summit Air," she said. The line went silent for a moment. Chen could hear her breathing, could picture her in her minimalist Palo Alto office, staring out at a future he was terrified was slipping away. "You have 48 hours, David. You need to make this right. Not with a press release, not with a boilerplate apology. You need to do something drastic. You need to show the world whose side you're on, the side of the past or the side of the future." The line clicked dead. David Chen stared at the phone. Make this right. How could he possibly make this right? He looked at Eleanor. "Get our legal team. Get a crisis PR firm. And find that kid Eric Thorne. Find him and find out what we have to do to fix this." But it was already too late. The story was no longer just about Eric or Captain Sterling. It was about Summit Air. The digital wildfire was burning out of control, and it was beginning to consume everything in its path. Down in San Diego, Captain Ryan Sterling, blissfully unaware of the inferno he had sparked, was ordering room service and preparing for his return flight the next morning, confident he had done the right thing. He had followed the rules. He had kept his plane safe. He had no idea he had just ended his own career and brought a multi-billion-dollar corporation to its knees. The next 24 hours were a masterclass in corporate implosion. Summit Air's first attempt to control the narrative was a disaster. They released a statement at midnight, a soulless piece of corporate jargon drafted by a committee of lawyers. It spoke of an abundance of caution, adherence to security protocols, and a commitment to the safety of our passengers and crew. It mentioned an internal investigation, but offered no apology to Eric Thorne. The public's reaction was immediate and venomous. The statement was ratioed on Twitter into oblivion. Abundance of caution became a sarcastic meme, with users posting pictures of everyday objects and describing them as potential threats. Late-night hosts sharpened their knives. Summit Air's new slogan, one quipped, "We'll get you there, provided you're not too smart or too black." For Eric, the experience was surreal. He was holed up in an airport hotel his parents had booked for him, the decathlon long missed. His phone was a ceaseless river of notifications. His parents, both lawyers, were handling the media requests, but the pressure was immense. He wasn't a hashtag. He was a kid who had just seen his dream die on a jet bridge. He kept replaying the scene in his mind, Captain Sterling's dismissive face, the averted eyes of the other passengers. He felt a profound sense of shame, even though he knew he'd done nothing wrong. It was the shame of being singled out, of being made to feel like a problem. Meanwhile, Captain Ryan Sterling was finally understanding the gravity of the situation. He had been grounded in San Diego, instructed not to speak to anyone. He watched the news in his hotel room, his jaw tightening with every report. They were calling him a racist. Him. Ryan Sterling, a 30-year veteran, a man who believed in order, discipline, and rules above all else. He saw Eric's school photos, the images of a smiling, clean-cut boy. He felt a flicker of something, not regret, but irritation. The boy had been polite, he'd grant him that, but he'd been defiant. He'd questioned his authority. In Sterling's world, that was the cardinal sin. He called his union representative, a grizzled old pilot named Frank. "They're crucifying me, Frank," Sterling said, his voice strained. "I made a security call. It's in the goddamn manual." "The manual doesn't account for viral videos, Rick." Frank sighed. "Corporate is in full panic mode. They're looking for a sacrificial lamb, and you're standing at the altar with an apple in your mouth. You need to lay low and let us handle it. Don't talk to anyone." But David Chen at Summit Air headquarters knew laying low wasn't an option. Evelyn Reed's 48-hour deadline was ticking down like a bomb. He'd tried everything. He'd offered to fly Eric and his entire family first class to anywhere in the world. He'd offered to personally fund a grant for Eric's school's science program. Through their lawyers, the Thorne family had politely but firmly declined everything. They didn't want a handout, they wanted accountability. The pressure wasn't just coming from Novatech. Other major sponsors of the San Viento Vipers were getting nervous. Calls were coming in from a national brewery, a car manufacturer, and a bank, all wanting assurances that the Summit Air Stadium wasn't about to become a toxic asset. The Vipers' ownership was panicking. The stadium was their future, and its name was about to become synonymous with bigotry. With 24 hours left on the clock, Chen made a desperate move. He scheduled a press conference and fired Captain Sterling. The announcement was blunt. Captain Sterling's actions were a gross deviation from Summit Air's values of inclusion and respect. Chen read from a teleprompter, his face a mask of corporate contrition. "His employment has been terminated effective immediately. We offer our deepest, unreserved apologies to Mr. Eric Thorne and his family." He thought it would be enough. He had offered up his sacrifice. He was wrong. In Palo Alto, Evelyn Reed watched the press conference on the massive screen in her boardroom. Her executive team was assembled, their faces grim. When Chen finished, Evelyn muted the sound. "What do we think?" she asked the room. Her chief marketing officer, a man named Ben Carter, spoke first. "He did what we asked. He fired the guy. It's a start." Evelyn shook her head. "No, it's a reaction. It's damage control. He didn't fire him because it was the right thing to do. He fired him because a video went viral and a sponsor threatened to walk. Look at his face. He's sorry they got caught. Not sorry it happened. The problem isn't just one pilot, Ben. The pilot is a symptom of a culture that allowed him to feel comfortable making that decision in the first place." She stood up and walked to the window overlooking the manicured Novatech campus. "For 10 years, our name will be on that stadium. Every time a family drives past, every time it's shown on Monday Night Football, it will be Novatech at Summit Air Stadium. We can't scrub their name off it. We'd be endorsing them. We'd be telling the world that this is acceptable, that you can ruin a kid's dream and all it costs you is one pilot's pension." She turned back to the room, her decision made. It's not enough. It will never be enough. She picked up her phone and dialed. David Chen was in his office fielding calls from Grateful Vipers executives when his direct line rang again. It was Evelyn. "David," he said, a note of relief in his voice. "I hope you saw the press conference. We took decisive action." "I saw it, David." Evelyn's voice was calm, almost funereal. "And it's not enough. We're out. Novatech is officially withdrawing our offer for the stadium naming rights. We will be issuing a press release in 1 hour stating that we are severing our partnership with the Vipers organization as long as Summit Air remains their primary sponsor." The floor dropped out from under David Chen. He sank into his chair, the phone feeling like a lead weight in his hand. $200 million. "Evelyn, we did what you asked." "You did what you thought would save the deal," she corrected him. "You didn't do what was right. What's right is a fundamental top-to-bottom cultural review. What's right is ensuring this never happens again. You're not there yet. Maybe you never will be. Goodbye, David." The line went dead. An hour later, the news broke. Novatech pulls out of $200 million stadium deal, citing Summit Air controversy. It was the kill shot. The next morning, Summit Air's stock opened down 28%. The other sponsors, seeing Novatech's move, began to flee like rats from a sinking ship. The brewery pulled its sponsorship. The car company followed. By noon, the San Viento Vipers had no choice. They released a statement of their own, announcing they were terminating their partnership with Summit Air. The Summit Air Stadium was dead before it was even born. David Chen's legacy was in ashes. And in a lonely hotel room, Ryan Sterling, now unemployed and unemployable, watched the empire he had inadvertently destroyed crumble on live television. His by-the-book decision hadn't just cost a boy a trophy. It had vaporized a dynasty. The unraveling was complete, but the real story, the one that explained everything, was still buried, waiting for someone to start digging. While corporations panicked and stocks tumbled, the human element of the story was starting to fade, replaced by financial headlines. This is where Sarah Jenkins came in. Jenkins was a veteran investigative reporter for The Atlantic, a Pulitzer finalist, known for her deep-dive profiles that connected individual stories to larger systemic issues. She wasn't interested in the stock price. She was interested in the why. Why did a 32-year veteran pilot with a perfect record suddenly throw it all away? Was it really just a single, inexplicable act of racism? Or was there something more? Her editor approved a travel budget, and Sarah flew to Chicago, then to Dallas. She started with Eric Thorne and his family. They were hesitant at first, burned by the sensationalist media frenzy. But Sarah wasn't looking for sound bites. She spent hours with them in their suburban home, not just asking about the incident, but about Eric's life, his passion for science, his ambitions. She met with his father, Daniel Thorne, a quiet, thoughtful patent attorney, and his mother, Elena, a history professor. "The thing that bothers me most," Daniel told Sarah, stirring a cup of tea, "is the certainty. The pilot, Sterling, he didn't even consider he could be wrong. He saw my son and his mind was made up. It felt practiced, like it wasn't the first time he'd made a judgment like that." That word practiced stuck with Sarah. Next, she tried to find Ryan Sterling. He had gone to ground. His home in a gated community outside Dallas was fortified against the media. But Sarah wasn't the media throng camped outside the gates. She used old-fashioned reporting, tracking down former colleagues, flight attendants who had worked with him, and other pilots from his Air Force days. A picture began to emerge. Sterling wasn't a monster. He wasn't a raving bigot. He was something more common and perhaps more insidious. He was a man obsessed with control and rigid hierarchies. In his world, there was a right way and a wrong way, a rule for everything. He was known for being overly critical of junior staff, for writing up flight attendants, for minor uniform infractions, for being a stickler on baggage weight limits. He demanded deference, and he was notoriously prickly with anyone who questioned his absolute authority as captain. One retired flight attendant, a woman named Maria, agreed to speak off the record. "Rick Sterling. We called him the Warden. Everything had to be just so. He wasn't overtly racist, not in a way you could ever report, but you could feel it. He was always a little more suspicious of black passengers, who were loud a little quicker to scrutinize a Hispanic family's carry-ons. It was subtle, plausible deniability. He'd always say, 'I'm just following the rules.' But he seemed to apply the rules differently depending on who you were. Plausible deniability, practiced. The pieces were clicking into place. This wasn't a sudden break in character. It was a lifetime of microaggressions, finally culminating in one macro disaster. Sarah's next step was to dig into Sterling's official flight record. Summit Air, in full damage control mode, stonewalled her. So she went the long way around filing Freedom of Information Act requests for any FAA reports or NTSB complaints that might mention his name. It was a tedious process, a mountain of paperwork. While she waited, she took a different tack. She investigated the regulation. Sterling had cited FAA 121.58, the captain's discretionary authority. She spoke to aviation law experts and senior pilots from other airlines. They all said the same thing: the rule was real, but Sterling's application of it was an extreme outlier. "That rule is a last resort," one veteran captain from a legacy carrier told her. "It's for when you have a genuinely disruptive or threatening passenger. You don't use it to bully a kid with a science project that TSA has already cleared. Never. That's a career ender." The question remained, why did Sterling feel so empowered to use it? Why was he so certain he was right? Weeks went by. The news cycle moved on. Summit Air began the slow, painful process of rebuilding its brand. David Chen resigned, and a new CEO was brought in with promises of a new era of transparency and training. The Thorne family filed a civil rights lawsuit. Ryan Sterling remained a ghost. Then, one rainy Tuesday afternoon, a thick manila envelope arrived at Sarah Jenkins's office. It was from the FAA. Inside was a stack of documents, mostly routine flight logs and weather reports. But buried deep within the pile stapled to the back of an old maintenance request from 20 years ago was a 2-page incident report from a flight that had been diverted due to a security scare. The flight was Skyline Airlines 447 from Atlanta to New York on May 12, 2005. Skyline was the regional carrier that had been bought out and absorbed into Summit Air a decade later. The report detailed the removal of a disruptive and non-compliant passenger who had been accused of tampering with the lavatory smoke detector. The passenger had vehemently denied it, claiming he was simply trying to fix a broken paper towel dispenser. The captain of that flight had a different name, but the report was co-signed by the first officer, who confirmed the captain's assessment of the passenger's agitated and suspicious behavior. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The first officer's signature was unmistakable, a sharp, angular script. R. Sterling. Her eyes scanned down to the name of the passenger who had been removed, escorted off the plane by Port Authority police, and subsequently banned from the airline. The name was Daniel Thorne, Eric Thorne's father. Sarah Jenkins stared at the paper, the world shrinking to the two names on that page. It wasn't just a coincidence. It was a ghost. A 20-year-old ghost that had just risen from a filing cabinet to explain everything. This wasn't a repeat offense. It was an echo. And the karma that was coming for Ryan Sterling was about to become harder and more personal than anyone could have ever imagined. The air in the Thorne family's living room was heavy with a stunned silence. Sarah Jenkins sat across from Daniel and Elena Thorne, the 20-year-old incident report lying on the coffee table between them like a venomous snake. Eric was upstairs in his room, unaware of the revelation that was about to reframe his entire life. "I don't understand," Elena said, her voice a whisper. "Daniel, you never told me you were banned from an airline." Daniel Thorne stared at the report, but his eyes were seeing something far away. He looked older than he had just an hour ago, the lines around his eyes deeper. "I wasn't banned," he said, his voice raspy with memory. "Not officially. They dropped the complaint when they found no evidence of tampering. But the damage was done. I was put on an informal watch list. For years, every time I tried to fly, I got the special screening. It became impossible to do my job." He finally looked at Sarah. "I was a consultant back then, traveled 4 days a week. After that incident, my career fell apart. I couldn't reliably get to my clients. I lost contracts. I eventually had to change professions entirely. That's when I went to law school." Sarah leaned forward, her recorder on the table. "Daniel, tell me what happened on that flight. Skyline 4447. He took a long, shuddering breath. "It was nothing. It was absurd. I went to the lavatory. The paper towel dispenser was jammed. I was a consultant. I fixed things for a living. So I jiggled the handle. A flight attendant came by and asked what I was doing. I told her. She gave me a strange look and walked away. 10 minutes later, the captain announced we were being diverted to Philadelphia due to a security issue. When we landed, police came on board and took me off the plane." "And the first officer?" Sarah asked gently. "Ryan Sterling. He was there." Daniel nodded, a dark realization dawning on his face. "He was the one standing behind the captain on the jet bridge while I was being questioned. A young guy then. Cocky. He didn't say a word. Just stood there with his arms crossed, watching me get torn apart by the captain's accusations. He had this look on his face, a look of absolute certainty. The same look my son described seeing on his face. It was all there. A young, ambitious First Officer Sterling, backing his captain's questionable judgment call against a black passenger. An incident that had no real consequences for the flight crew, but had catastrophic, life-altering consequences for the passenger. Sterling had seen firsthand that a man's life could be derailed based on a flimsy pretext, and the system would back him up. He hadn't been punished. He'd been rewarded with the silent affirmation that his gut feelings about certain people were a valid part of the job. It hadn't taught him a lesson. It had taught him a method. He didn't remember me. Daniel murmured the horror of it sinking in. 20 years later, he saw my son holding a box of electronics, and he didn't see a kid. He just saw the same thing he saw when he looked at me. A threat to be managed, a nail to be hammered down. The story was no longer about a pilot's bad day or a single instance of prejudice. It was a chilling saga of cause and effect, a direct line drawn across 2 decades. Ryan Sterling hadn't just ruined one dream. He had unknowingly come back to shatter the son of the man whose life he had helped derail 20 years prior. Sarah Jenkins knew she had the story of her career. But it was more than that. It was a profound and terrible tragedy. She spent the next 2 days verifying every detail, cross-referencing flight manifests, and confirming Sterling's employment history with the now-defunct Skyline Airlines. She found the original captain, now retired in Florida, who barely remembered the incident, dismissing it as a minor diversion, just following procedure. He didn't even remember Daniel Thorne's name. To him, it was a blip. To Daniel, it was a cataclysm. Sarah's final call was to Ryan Sterling's lawyer. She laid out the facts she had uncovered, giving him a chance to respond on his client's behalf. The lawyer was blindsided. He promised to call back. The call came 2 hours later. "Mr. Sterling has no comment," the lawyer said, his voice stiff. "And any attempt to publish this defamatory and speculative connection will be met with swift legal action." It was the confirmation Sarah needed. She wrote the article that night, fueled by coffee and a cold, righteous anger. The headline was simple and brutal as the echo on the jet bridge. How a pilot's buried past crashed a father's career and then came for his son. She described the incident with Eric in vivid detail. Then she pivoted. She took the reader back 20 years to Flight 447. She told the story of Daniel Thorne, the promising young consultant whose career was shattered. She laid out the evidence piece by damning piece, connecting the 2 events, not just by the man at the center of them, but by the insidious, unchecked bias that had been allowed to fester for 2 decades. The article was a bombshell. It went live on the Atlantic's website on a Thursday morning. Within minutes, it was the most read story in the country. The narrative exploded with new force. This wasn't just a story of racism anymore. It was a story of cosmic, cruel irony. It was a real-life tale of karma of a ghost from the past, returning to claim its due in the most public and devastating way imaginable. For Ryan Sterling, hiding in his suburban fortress, the world as he knew it was about to end. The shrapnel from this explosion wouldn't just take his career. It was coming for his home, his family, and his very identity. The publication of Sarah Jenkins's article was not a firestorm. It was a nuclear detonation. The story was everywhere, on every network morning show, every cable news panel, every social media feed. The name Ryan Sterling was now irrevocably linked, not to a single mistake, but to a pattern of destructive prejudice. He was no longer just a disgraced pilot. He was the villain in a multi-generational American tragedy. The hardest karma, however, always hits closest to home. Ryan Sterling had one source of pride left in his life, his 24-year-old son, Ben. Ben was a third-year law student at Georgetown, a bright, idealistic young man who had always idolized his father's discipline and integrity. When the initial incident with Eric Thorne had happened, Ben had defended his dad to his friends, arguing that he was just a stickler for safety, that the media was twisting it. But Sarah's article changed everything. Ben read it on his phone in the university law library, his blood turning to ice. He saw the incident report with his father's signature. He read Daniel Thorne's account of his ruined career. He saw the direct, undeniable line between the two events. His father wasn't just a rule follower. He was a man who had participated in the destruction of a black man's life and had apparently learned nothing from it. It was a betrayal of every value Ben thought his father stood for. He flew home to Dallas that night. He found his father in the den, the curtains drawn, watching a cable news segment about himself with the sound off. The elder Sterling looked haggard, a ghost in his own home. "Did you do it?" Ben asked, his voice trembling with a mix of rage and grief. He held up his phone, the article glowing on the screen. "The first time, with Daniel Thorne. Is it true?" Ryan looked at his son, his only child, and for the first time, the impenetrable wall of his self-righteousness began to crumble. He saw not a journalist or a lawyer in his son's eyes, but a judge. "It was a different time, Ben." He stammered, his voice weak. "The captain made a call. I was the first officer. I had to back him up. That's the chain of command." "The chain of command!" Ben's voice rose to a shout. "You stood there and watched them ruin an innocent man's life over a paper towel dispenser, and you call that the chain of command. You destroyed his career. And then 20 years later, fate or God or whatever you want to call it, gives you a second chance. It puts that man's son right in front of you. A brilliant kid on his way to greatness. And what do? You do the exact same thing. You didn't learn a thing. You just got older and more powerful." "You don't understand the pressures of the job," Ryan began, but Ben cut him off. "No, I don't think you understand anything," Ben said, his voice breaking. "I have defended you my entire life. Your rigidity, your harshness. I told everyone it was because you were a man of principle. But you're not. Your principles are just a cover for your prejudices. All that talk about rules and safety. It was never about safety. It was about power. It was about you getting to decide who belongs and who doesn't." Tears were streaming down Ben's face now. "I can't be your son anymore. Not like this. I look at you and I don't see my father. I see a bully and a coward." He turned and walked out of the room, leaving his father utterly broken. The loss of his job was one thing. The loss of his reputation was another. But the loss of his son's respect was a wound from which he would never recover. Ryan Sterling, the man of iron discipline, finally broke down and wept, the sound swallowed by the silence of his empty, darkened house. The public reckoning was just as brutal. The Thorne family's lawsuit, once a simple civil rights claim, was now a legal behemoth. With the new evidence of a prior incident, their lawyers amended the complaint to allege a pattern of discriminatory conduct, not just by Sterling, but by Summit Air and its predecessor Skyline, for failing to properly discipline him 20 years earlier. Facing a legal and PR cataclysm, Summit Air's new CEO did the only thing he could. He didn't just offer a settlement. He flew to Chicago with a team of executives and met with the Thorne family in person. In front of a select group of reporters, including Sarah Jenkins, the CEO, offered a public, profound apology, not just to Eric, but to Daniel. The company announced a multi-million-dollar settlement with the family, the exact amount sealed, but rumored to be astronomical. More than that, they announced the Thorne Initiative, a $50 million partnership with MIT and historically black colleges and universities to create scholarships and mentorship programs for minority students in STEM fields. Eric Thorne, at his own insistence, was given a permanent seat on the initiative's oversight board. Eric, standing beside his father, spoke to the press for the first time. He was no longer the shaken boy on the jet bridge. He was composed, confident, and wise beyond his years. "This was never about money," he said, his voice clear and strong. It was about accountability. Captain Sterling's actions were wrong, but he was part of a system that allowed his bias to go unchecked for decades. Our hope is that this settlement and this initiative will begin to change that system to ensure that the next kid with a dream in a box is judged by the contents of his character and his intellect, not the color of his skin. The reckoning was complete. The corporation was paying in money and radical policy changes. The family had received not just compensation, but a meaningful restorative justice. And Ryan Sterling, the man at the center of it all, was left with nothing. He had lost his career, his reputation, his son, and the lie he had told himself for 30 years that he was a good man just following the rules. He was forced to see himself as the world now saw him. And that was the hardest karma of all. In the months that followed, the dust from the public detonation began to settle, revealing a new landscape forged by the firestorm, where every major player found their final, unalterable destination. The story was over, but its consequences, like echoes in a canyon, would reverberate for years to come. For Summit Air, the path forward was one of radical and painful reconstruction. The board, having ousted David Chen, brought in a renowned corporate fixer, a CEO named Brenda Walsh, whose reputation was built on navigating companies through ethical minefields. She understood that the crisis was not a PR problem, but a soul problem. The Thorn Initiative was her first and most visible act, but she knew it had to be more than a guilt payment. She personally oversaw the complete overhaul of their employee training programs. The old check-the-box sensitivity videos were replaced with intensive multi-day workshops run by leading sociologists and de-escalation experts. Pilots and flight attendants were put through grueling, realistic simulations, forced to confront their own biases in scenarios designed to test their judgment and empathy, not just their knowledge of the rule book. The changes were met with internal resistance. A small but vocal contingent of veteran employees grumbled about woke nonsense and corporate overreach. Walsh's response was swift and uncompromising: adapt or leave. The company, she declared in a company-wide town hall, would rather fly with a smaller, more conscientious crew than a larger one poisoned by the past. The scar on the brand was permanent, but under her leadership, it began to look less like a wound and more like a testament to a lesson learned the hard way. The Summit Air logo, once a symbol of corporate disgrace, slowly began to represent the possibility of redemption. Eric Thorne, meanwhile, navigated the surreal transition from anonymous prodigy to national icon. He accepted the Kittering Scholarship, arriving on the hallowed grounds of MIT, not just as a freshman, but as a living symbol of resilience. He found a delicate balance, immersing himself in the complex worlds of quantum computing and material science while fulfilling the obligations of his new platform. He became a powerful voice on the oversight board of the Thorn Initiative, not as a figurehead, but as its conscience. During quarterly video conferences, the polished Summit Air executives would find themselves being held to account by a 17-year-old who spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had paid the price for their past failures. He ensured the money went to scholarships and lab resources, not administrative bloat, personally mentoring the first class of Thorn scholars. His father Daniel often visited him on campus, and they would walk along the Charles River, two men bound by a shared trauma that had been transformed into a legacy of hope. The wound Sterling had inflicted on their family had, through their grace, become a wellspring of opportunity for countless others. For her work, Sarah Jenkins received the ultimate recognition in her field. She was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for national reporting. Her article, "The Echo on the Jet Bridge," became required reading in journalism schools across the country, a master class in how to meticulously uncover the roots of a single injustice and expose the systemic rot beneath. She had given a voice to the thorns, and in doing so had crafted a permanent record of accountability. And what of Ryan Sterling? His was a quieter, more tragic final destination. There was no dramatic trial or public confrontation. There was only a slow, inexorable descent into obscurity. He became a recluse, a ghost, haunting the wreckage of his own life. The lawsuit had consumed most of his wealth, forcing him to sell his stately home in the gated community. He moved into a small beige apartment in a sprawling complex on the other side of the state, where the anonymity he once commanded as a captain was replaced by the crushing anonymity of being a nobody. His days became a monotonous loop of silence and regret. The crisp, authoritative uniform that had been his skin for 30 years was gone, replaced by the shapeless clothes of a man with nowhere to go. In the beginning, he tried to justify his actions to himself, reciting the FAA regulations like a mantra, clinging to the fiction that he was a man of principle who had simply been caught in a media trap. But the logic always crumbled, leaving behind the raw, undeniable truth. He had been a bully and a coward. He had destroyed one man's career out of arrogant suspicion and tried to do the same to his son. The final killing blow to his self-delusion came a year after the incident. He was watching the evening news when a segment came on about the first class of Thorn Initiative scholars arriving at MIT. He watched as Eric, now a poised and confident young man, shook hands with the students, a diverse group of brilliant young minds, their faces alight with promise. In that moment, watching the future he had so casually tried to extinguish, Ryan Sterling finally understood. It wasn't an epiphany of redemption. It was a devastating recognition of his own smallness. He saw the sheer scale of the potential, the innovation, and the good he had tried to ground on that jet bridge. He had appointed himself the gatekeeper of a tiny, insignificant door, while Eric Thorne was building keys to the universe. He turned off the television, and the silence in the room was absolute. His karma wasn't a lightning bolt from the heavens. It was this: the quiet, permanent, hollow silence of his empty life, a life sentence of knowing with perfect clarity exactly who he was. The world had moved on. The story was no longer his. It belonged to the future, a future being built by the very people he had tried to keep from taking flight. The story of Eric Thorne and Ryan Sterling serves as a powerful real-world parable for our times. It shows how a single moment of prejudice, however small it may seem to the person committing it, can trigger an avalanche of consequences that can reshape lives, topple industries, and redefine justice. It's a stark reminder that true accountability is not just about punishing one person. It's about fixing the broken systems that empower them. Eric's journey from a humiliated boy on a jet bridge to a national symbol of grace and strength shows us the incredible power of resilience. And the tragic downfall of Captain Sterling demonstrates an inescapable truth. Karma isn't a mystical force. It is the logical and often brutal result of our own actions coming back to us. What do you think was the corporate response from Summit Air enough to fix the problem? What does this story say about the power of social media to hold people and corporations accountable? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved, you please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and be sure to subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the stories that matter. Thank you for listening.